وسهلا بكم. نرحب بكم في محاضرة يوسف صايغ التنموية للعام 2020. اسمحوا لي أن أوضح لكم بروتوكول إدارة هذا الحدث، خاصة المشاركين عبر الزوم، فأرجو انتباهكم. ستقوم المحاضرة بتقديم المحاضرة من لندن من خلال بث حي ومباشر، وسيقوم ماس في فلسطين بإدارة الحدث. ستظهر أسماء جميع المشاركين معنا على الشاشة، لكن لن تظهر صورة أحد سوى المتحدثين الرئيسيين. سيتم تعطيل الدردشة والصوت والفيديو للمشاركين عبر الزوم، ولكن يمكن إرسال رسالة للمحاضرة عبر الزوم، وسيتم اختيار مجموعة منها وطرحها عليها. يلي المحاضرة نقاش تفاعلي مدته 30 دقيقة مع المشاركين، بحيث تكون الجولة الأولى من الأسئلة مع الضيوف المتواجدين في قاعة المعهد وجاهيا. أما الجولة الثانية فسيتم انتقاء مجموعة من الأسئلة التي يرسلها المشاركون من خلال الزوم. نود أن نلفت انتباهكم بأنه يتوفر ترجمة فورية لتسهيل التواصل مع أي متحدث. والآن لنبدأ المحاضرة بكلمة الافتتاح يلقيها المدير العام للمعهد السيد رجل خالدي، فليتفضل مشكورا.
مرحبا للجميع وأهلا وسهلا بالجميع. دولة رئيس الوزراء الفلسطيني الدكتور محمد شتي حفظه الله، بروفيسورة ماريانا مازوكاتو المحترمة، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة السيدات والسادة الكرام، يسعدني أن أرحب لأول مرة كمدير عام للمعهد بالجمهور الكبير المشارك معنا في هذا اليوم الذي نحتفي فيه بذكرى أحد كبار المفكرين العرب المعاصرين، الفلسطيني الذي عاش لاجئا في بلاد العرب والغربة قبل كل حياته، ولم يعد للوطن الذي كرس جل أعماله له، تقديرا لإسهاماته في التأسيس لمفهوم دراسات التنمية الفلسطينية الدكتور يوسف عبد الله صايغ. نشكركم جميعا المشاركين الكرام من فلسطين والمنطقة العربية ومن أوروبا وآسيا وأمريكا على حضور هذه المحاضرة 11 في هذه السلسلة. كما نشكركم سلفا على الالتزام بالإجراءات المعتمدة لإدارة مثل هذا الحدث الكبير عبر القارات على أفضل وجه. أنه لشرف كبير لمعهد أبحاث السياسات الاقتصادي الفلسطيني ماس أن يستضيف العالمة والناشطة الاقتصادية المميزة بروفيسورة ماريانا مازوكاتو، أستاذة اقتصاد الابتكار والقيمة العامة في جامعة كلية لندن، لتشركنا بأفكارها الرائدة وتحليلها حول آليات عمل الاقتصاد الرأسمالي المعاصر، وخاصة ثلاثية الاستثمار والابتكار والنمو في هذه السنة العاصفة التي قلبت الكثير من المفاهيم المسبقة وأفقرت مئات الملايين وأطاحت برؤساء وتحدت جميع شعوب العالم. ربما يسأل كل من مشارك من فلسطين أو ماليزيا أو بريطانيا، ما علاقة أفكار مازوكاتو بحالة خاصة جدا كفلسطين، حيث أصل المشكلة سياسي؟ ولماذا يهتم معهد أبحاث فلسطيني أصلا بالاستماع لها، وحالة فلسطين الاقتصادية بعيدة كل البعد عما تفترضه نظريات المحاضرة الجليلة، خاصة أن تجربتنا مع مفهوم الدولة كانت محفوفة بتحديات جمة، مما يفسر ما نشهده من تراجع مستمر لهيبتها ومكانتها وثقة المواطنين في الظروف المهيئة لإقامتها على أرض الواقع. دوري طبعا ليس التحدث بالنيابة عن البروفيسورة، وعليكم استنتاج ما يفيدكم من أفكارها، لكن من وجهة نظري المهنية والشخصية فإن ما تطرحه يفتح مجالات جديدة للتعامل السياساتي مع قضايا الاستثمار العام المجازف والأولوية للاستثمار العام في الابتكار وتصحيح الخلل في العلاقة بين السوق والقيمة الحقيقية للسلع والخدمات العامة، وهي مسائل ليست نظرية على الإطلاق، ولا بد أن تكون على أجندات من يصنعون السياسات الاقتصادية الفلسطينية. من هنا نقول لضيوفنا من حول العالم إننا في فلسطين رغم العزلة وحالة الصمود أمام الحصار والاستعمار لم نكن أبداً بعيدين عن التواصل مع مستجدات الفكر والسياسات الاقتصادية الدولية. وهذا يعيدنا إلى إرث بروفيسور صايغ الذي واكب جميع مراحل نضوج الفكر الاقتصادي الفلسطيني منذ أصوله العروبية في الخمسينات والستينات، مرورا بمرحلة التقارب مع الفكر الثوري التحرري السائد في العالم الثالث، الذي عكس صايغ أفضلها في خطة منظمة التحرير الفلسطينية في العام 1993 لإنماء الاقتصاد الوطني الفلسطيني. بقي الصايغ يجتهد علميا وصولا إلى مرحلة العولمة والتحرير الاقتصادي واتفاقيات أوسلو وباريس الاقتصادية وغيرها، التي ربما سلم الصايغ من واجب التعامل معها بعد ذلك، حيث آثرت السلطة الفلسطينية الناشئة الاستماع إلى نصائح مؤسسة إجماع واشنطن التي نشطت منذ 25 سنة في ملء الفراغ في التوجه الاقتصادي الذي تركه غياب الصايغ عن المشهد منذ ذلك الحين. وهنا يسعدني الإشارة إلى مشاركة الدكتورة روزماري صايغ معنا اليوم، وهي زوجة البروفيسور وعالمة أنثروبولوجية اللاجئين الفلسطينيين المميزة بحد ذاتها، وأبنائها أيضا المقيمين في الشتات، فأهلا وسهلا بكم. أعود لبروفيسور مازوكاتو. ما يميز أفكارها ليس فقط أنها تسائل الكثير مما بات يعرف بالحكمة التقليدية الاقتصادية الشائعة عالميا في فلسطين وكذلك، لكن التغطية الإعلامية الإيجابية التي حازت عليها من عمالقة إعلام كالفاينانشال تايمز ونيويورك تايمز ومجلة صندوق النقد الدولي تشير ربما إلى قدرتها المميزة في التحدث عن المسائل الحساسة سياساتيا بلغة اقتصادية فنية واضحة، ما يبني الجسور بين التيارات ويشجع المزيد من الحوار والتواضع والواقعية في النقاش ما بين الاقتصاديين وبينهم والجمهور الذي يتكبد ويتحمل تداعيات أخطائهم وأحيانا إنجازاتهم. بالتالي توفر لنا محاضرة اليوم بمشاركة مثل هذه النخب من حول العالم وفلسطين فرصة ليس فقط للتذكير بإرث يوسف صايغ الاقتصادي التحرري بمساعدة البروفيسورة من خلال عرضها للتيارات العلمية الاقتصادية وجسرها للفجوة بين الفكر المهيمن حاليا واحتياجات المستقبل، لكن أيضا لنذكر العالم أنه اليوم من خلال بث هذه المحاضرة من فلسطين فإننا نبني وطن رغم الاحتلال والقهر، ونبني اقتصاد برغم الحصار وسرقة الموارد، ونبني أيضا فكر يعود إلى الصايغ ومن سبقوه في تصوير كيف يمكن بناء اقتصاد فلسطيني منتج ومعاصر وعادل. ويستمر هذا البناء بمشاركة أصدقائنا الجدد من حول العالم في لقائنا اليوم. تقديراً لمشاركة البروفيسورة ماريانا مازوكاتو معنا اليوم، وقبل بدء محاضرتها اسمحوا لي أن أقدم لكم ضيفاً خاصاً يرغب في المشاركة في ترحيبنا بالمحاضرة. يسرني أن أقدم لكم دولة رئيس الوزراء دكتور محمد شتاي، فليتفضل. تفضل دكتور، أهلا وسهلا فيك.
شكرا جزيلا أخي العزيز دكتور رجا الخالدي. شكرا لمؤسسة ماس على تكريم علم من أعلام فلسطين المرحوم البروفيسور الصديق يوسف صايغ، وقد عملت معه في خطة منظمة التحرير، وكنا بالفريق الواحد في اجتماع الأول للدول المانحة الذي عقد في باريس من أجل فلسطين عام 94. ويسعدني أيضا أن أرحب بضيفتكم ضيفة فلسطين البروفيسورة ماريانا مازوكاتو التي هي نأمل أن نوجه لها دعوة مفتوحة لتكون ضيفة شخصية على فلسطين وليس عبر التكنولوجيا البعيدة التي تقرب الناس بعضها من بعض. بجميع الأحوال إخواني الحاضرين السامعين، نحن في فلسطين منذ أن تسلمنا هذه الحكومة نقوم بمراجعة أدائنا وجهدنا في مجال التنمية الوطنية ضمن إطار الانفكاك من العلاقة الكولونيالية التي فرضها علينا واقع الاحتلال. كما نقوم أيضا بإعادة هيكلة الاقتصاد والتنمية ضمن منظور جديد، وهو التنمية بالعناقيد clusters development، وتحقيق العدالة الاجتماعية والاقتصادية أيضا من أجل الوصول إلى توازن جندري في عملية التنمية. نحن أخي العزيز دكتور رجا من مدرسة كينز، وبسبب الظروف الخاصة في فلسطين نرى أن دور الدولة أكبر من أي مكان آخر. استثمارات القطاع العام في الكثير من مجالات الدولة، وتصبح هنا الدولة هي الملاذ الأول، تصبح الدولة the first resort اللي فيها الإنسان بسبب الظروف الحالية في فلسطين تصبح مسؤوليتنا أكبر من أي قطاع آخر. وقد بنينا خططنا التنموية على أن تكون ليس up to date، ولكن أردنا لخططنا التنموية أن تكون up to tomorrow، تكون جاهزة لبكرة. ولهذا أردنا أن نكون more green، more digital، more inclusive. بمعنى more green، هذه البلد فيها 310 أيام من الشمس المشرقة، ولذلك تركيزنا على موضوع السولار انرجي. مور ديجيتال، احنا ما عندناش عملة وطنية، ولذلك الآن كل الدراسات نقوم بها من أجل أن يكون عندنا ديجيتال بيمنتس، الكترونيك بيمنتس، ديجيتال كرنسي، اللي نحاول فيها نتغلب على معيقات الاحتلال. مور انكلوسيف، لأنه احنا مجتمع في غزة مثلا 62% من الناس لاجئين لا يملكوا وسائل الإنتاج، 40% من الناس في الضفة الغربية من اللاجئين، ولذلك لا يمكن لأي عملية تنمية إلا أن تكون انكلوسيف. عشان نكون انكلوسيف لازم الناس يكون عندها access to money، وهذا الكلام يعني توفير قروض ميسرة concessionary loans، guarantees، مساهمات بالإكويتي، وتكنيكال أسيستنس اللي تعلم الناس كيف يصل إلى التمويل سواء كان البنكي أو غيره. الشيء الآخر إخواني الحضور، بدون أدنى شك عندما نتعامل مع الاس دي جيز الديفلوبمنت جولز ندرك تماما أنها بعضها قابل للتحقيق بدرجات مختلفة، وبعضها غير قابل للتحقيق. ولذلك هناك صراع جدي وحقيقي في العالم على أننا هل باستطاعتنا أن نصل إلى أهداف التنمية المستدامة Sustainable Development Goals، أو أنه ليس من السهل الوصول إلى هذه الأهداف. هذا يبقى سؤال مهم، لكن بفلسطين تركيزنا هو على القضايا المتعلقة بالبطالة ومحاربة الفقر بشكل أساسي. من جانب آخر تركيزنا أيضا هو على الاستثمار في القطاعات الإنتاجية. للأسف الشديد معظم القروض المقدمة من البنوك معظمها تصرف في قطاعات غير إنتاجية، في قطاعات العقارات real estates. real estate does not generate growth. ولذلك لما بنتعامل مع هذا الموضوع برام الله والبيري 12,000 وحدة سكنية فارغة، ولذلك في عرض وفي طلب، ولكن الناس they can't afford، لأنه هالقد سعر الشقة في رام الله أغلى من سعر الشقة في تل أبيب. لذلك هذا الموضوع يحتاج إلى معالجة جدية وحقيقية، وبناء عليه احنا سنقوم بتأسيس investment bank اللي يوفر تمويل للقطاعات الإنتاجية. الإشي الآخر اللي بحب أذكره قبل ما أختتم إنه إحنا ندرك إنه في هذا العصر في فرص عمل تموت وفي فرص عمل جديدة يتم خلقها. Some jobs are dying and new jobs are created. وهذا الكلام لذلك لما بنحكي على innovation and contribution to growth لازم احنا كفلسطين نكون up to tomorrow عشان نكون عارفين حالنا وين بدنا نروح في هذا الموضوع. والشيء الأخير اللي بحب أذكره أمام البروفيسورة مريانا إنه احنا بنعرف أن الثروة في الماضي كان عمادها الأرض والإقطاعيين، ولاحقا أصبحت الثروة wealth was concentrated in the hands of factory owners who became the capitalists. Today, who owns the money is the data owners. ولذلك اليوم هذا التحول الهائل في المجتمع العالمي بنقل الثروة من الأرض إلى المصنع إلى الكلاود، هذا هو اللي بالمجمل خلى الثروة مركزة في أيدي عدد بسيط من العالم. موازنة فيسبوك أكثر من 20 دولة نامية في العالم. لذلك السؤال المفصلي بالنسبة لنا هو ليس تركيز الثروة، ولكن السؤال كيف نعمل income distribution، كيف نعالج income distribution ليس على صعيد الناشونال ستيت ولكن globally. هذا سؤال كبير، وعشان نكون احنا inclusive بنحاول قدر الإمكان إنه نحط التنمية الوطنية في سياقها الشمولي، بحيث إنه الفلسطيني يكون هو صاحب المبادرة في كل القضايا المتعلقة فيه. أنا على ثقة إنه الدكتورة مريانا التي ستتحدث لكم حول Rethinking Value Creation for Innovative Led Inclusive and Sustainable Growth، أنا على ثقة أنها ستعالج معظم هذه القضايا، وإحنا كلنا آذان صاغية. أتمنى لكم محاضرة ممتعة، ومرحبا فيك في فلسطين فيرتشوالي، ومرحبا فيك في فلسطين بيرسونالي. أهلا وسهلا. شكرا دكتور رجاء.
وشكرا لك دكتور محمد، كل احترام لهذا المداخلة الهامة. Professor, we are all ears. Please, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, take the floor.
Thank you so much. I cannot tell you what an honor it is. So thank you, Prime Minister Dr. Shtaya. Thank you to the صايغ family, who I know or I hear are watching. And thank you especially to MAS, the Director General and the organizers for this invitation. It's just, you know, an incredible honor. And I really hope this is just the beginning of a conversation, an aperitivo, as we say in Italian. And I would also like to put out an offer. If anyone in MAS would like to exchange, I am willing to help with Italian lessons if you teach me Arabic. Listening to you over the last minutes, I could not stop thinking you have literally one of the most beautiful languages, I think, and I would love to learn it. So let's barter. So I will now share my screen because I have slides. This is always the difficult. Oh, it says host disabled attendee screen sharing. I think someone needs to enable me. Let's see here. I think with Zoom, you need to switch who the host is. There we go. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Let me just do full screen. And the little words I could hear from the introductions were precisely when you were saying inclusive, sustainable growth, investor first resort. So these are all issues I will be talking about. I really want to start a dialogue with the state of Palestine to think about what does it actually mean in terms of on-the-ground tools, on-the-ground changes to rethink value creation in order to steer an economy to be truly investment-led, not consumption-led, innovation-led, inclusive and sustainable. And what does it mean for the way that policy is designed, but especially also the way that public and private sector actors collaborate? What does it mean for the contracts, the relationships? And what's interesting, sorry, this isn't moving forward. Here we go. The current mood that we are all in is, of course, a very negative one. We are experiencing, a health pandemic of the size that none of us in our lifetime have experienced, but this is a multiple, triple, quadruple crisis that we're living through. We have a climate crisis. We're still, in many countries around the world, have the remnants of the financial crisis from 2007, 2008, and now this health pandemic. And one of the more optimistic sides of things is at least that since the financial crisis, there has been a lot of language about steering the economy in a new way, about directing the economy in a new way. Since 2015, we have 17 Sustainable Development Goals that every country, including the State of Palestine, have signed up to. In fact, the State of Palestine was one of the pioneers, really, in the Arab region to adapt and implement the 2030 agenda of the SDGs and actually establish a governmental mechanism needed to support the implementation of these 17 goals. But these are radical goals. Sometimes people say that they're a bit of a shopping list, but they are radical. If you look at what they say, they talk about zero hunger, no poverty, decent work. And if you unpick these 17 goals and look at all the targets underneath them, there's 169 targets. And what they actually mean in different contexts, in different cities, in different regions, in different nations, at different levels of development, has to be then negotiated ground up. This cannot be fed sort of top down by the experts, but these are challenges, 17 goals that have been agreed on. So what does it mean? What does it mean for the way that we steer our economy? What does it mean for industrial strategy? What does it mean for innovation policy? What does it mean for how we design procurement, grants and loans? And these are all issues that I'll come to towards the end of the lecture. But I just want to pause here for a minute, because this is the good news. This is the news that we don't actually have to really convince anyone that we need to be speaking about the direction of growth. These goals and the fact that we talk about a Green Deal globally and the fact that these words, inclusive and sustainable, are out there means that, perhaps the world has woken up, that it's not enough just to talk about growth. And also, I want to say that it's also a stage in capitalism where there's been a bit of wakening up in the corporate community too, that, the status quo doesn't work. So for the last 2 years in places like Davos, there's been lots of talk that corporate governance needs to change in order to reach these sustainable goals. There's been talk that, this short-term focus just on profit maximization, focus on share prices, doesn't work. And this concept of stakeholder value is starting to really kind of take to the floor. And it's something that academics have talked about for a long time, but it wasn't really part of the lingo, the language that was being used in corporate boards. And I'm not saying it's happening. In fact, I don't think it's happening, but at least the language is there. So we have language in the policy arena, we have language in the business arena, and yet things aren't changing quick enough. So again, what I really want to be speaking to you about is what would it look like to actually walk this talk, the talk of sustainability and the talk of stakeholder value. And one of the key things that I will argue in my lecture today, and I don't get tired of arguing it, so apologies for those who've heard me talk about this before, but until I see change, I will continue to repeat myself. We have to change the framework. This idea that at best, the policy-making process is about fixing market failures is absolutely one of the biggest bottlenecks we currently have. We're not going to be able to fix our way towards the Sustainable Development Goals. We can't fix our way towards having a serious industrial strategy that causes, structural change, transformative change within economies, especially, but not only in developing countries facing very serious challenges. And, the Green Deal is not going to be, fixed through. We have to have a different approach. And I call this different approach the co-creation and co-shaping of markets towards the direction that we actually need, inclusive sustainable growth, fine. But the framing has to be co-creating markets and co-shaping markets. We can't fix our way there. So before I go into what does that actually look like and its relevance, and I hope we talk about the relevance for Palestine in the discussion, but its relevance for different countries and the experiences that I've been witnessing in some of this work globally. Before I do that, I just want to make sure we're on the same page on why we need change, because there's no point in saying we need stakeholder value or we need SDGs if everything's fine. So in what sense is everything not fine? What are the big problems pre-COVID? Even the big problems really before we started even to really talk about the SDGs. I think they have to be nested. Our understanding of the problems have to be nested in our understanding actually of markets themselves. There's no market out there which then forces market pressures on different actors. The market itself is an outcome of how business is governed, how the state governs its own institutions, and especially how these different actors which co-create value interrelate. So the market is an outcome of governance of organizations and interrelationships between organizations. And so what I want to do is kind of just very quickly, in 5 minutes, go through the huge problems we have in the governance of these value-creating organizations and their interrelationships. So the first problem we have is in the financial sector itself. And this graph here is from the Bank of England, just showing what has happened in recent years in the financial sector, broadly defined. And the problem is that it's been basically financing itself. The growth of financial intermediation has outpaced the growth of the real economy to a large extent because a lot of global finance has gone back into finance, insurance, and real estate. The acronym for that is FIRE. So not only is the planet on fire in terms of global warming, that people like Greta Thunberg remind us every day, but literally our economy is on fire in terms of just the problematic way that we've allowed the financial sector itself to just plow funds back into finance, insurance, and real estate. This data here is for the UK from the Bank of England, but I can tell you that globally the numbers look very similar. In the UK and in the US, where a lot of the key problems from the financial crisis began, the current numbers are not looking any better than they did in 2007, 2008. So in the UK, only 20% of the finance goes back to the real economy itself. Most of it, again, goes back into FIRE. And because wages haven't been growing, what you actually have is a lot of this mortgage credit, which is increasing because people are actually being, incentivized to buy houses because there's all this credit out there. The amount of private debt to disposable income, so private debt, not public debt, to disposable income is back at record levels. And so this financialization of the economy very much then steers these house price bubbles because you get a lot of demand for housing, a lot of credit in order to finance it because people don't just have a lot of cash in their savings account to buy it. And this has been fueling another housing bubble worldwide, but more than that, it's been very much fueling this financialized source of finance in the economy. And it would be great if the problems were just there, but the problem is industry itself, the real economy itself has become financialized. And you can see this with different types of metrics, but globally, the Fortune 500 companies have spent over 4 trillion. I have the more recent numbers are 4 trillion. This was data just up until 2017. Looking back a decade, $4 trillion in the last 10 years have been spent just on companies, the largest companies which have global operations, buying back their own shares to boost stock prices, to boost stock options, and surprise, surprise, executive pay. And this financialized way in which global resources are being used, not being reinvested back into production, into human capital formation, into research and development, but just to boost short-term share prices. You also see the effects of this if you break down GDP, an imperfect measure, but actually you can see a lot when you look at it. You see this in terms of the fall in many countries of investment, of business investment as a share of GDP. So when we say that we have too much consumption-led growth, that means that often that consumption is being fueled by private debt, but also that the investment side of things is not steering global growth. And this is related to the inequality problem. So when you have a lack of reinvestment, and I'll come back to this later, that means literally lack of reinvestment into people, for example, who work in companies. And this problem that sometimes is framed as the robots are taking our job, digitalization will take our jobs is a very misconstrued way to talk about the problem that workers are facing today. In fact, mechanization has been taking jobs for 200 years. David Ricardo, one of the first kind of proper economists, already wrote back in 1821 a very famous book called Principles of Political Economy, where there was a chapter 31, called On Machinery, where he already was saying, hey, all this mechanization is going to be labor displacing. There's going to be downward pressure on wages, and it will, cause unemployment. And he and also Karl Marx looked at this very, astutely. But what you then had for 200 years up until recently is that, yes, mechanization was labor displacing, but as long as profits were being reinvested back into the system, actually new jobs appeared. You had kind of creative destruction in terms of some jobs go, then new jobs appear. And as long as the investments was actually going into workers themselves, their ability also to transition to new phases of capitalist production was there. And so what you have when you have a fall in that reinvestment cycle and siphoning of value out, this also fuels the inequality problem. And the inequality problem, you can look at it in different ways, but the basic fact that real wages have not been keeping up with labor productivity means that labor has not been getting its share of the value it helps to create. So the whole 1%, 99% problem, it's both fueled by very problematic taxation structures we have, but it's also a power issue, a negotiation of how we distribute the value that's created. And when you have not only weak labor unions globally, but also corporate business practices, which are not investing in workers and treating workers with the dignity and respect that they require, this has absolutely affected these statistics. And what is the statistic? That the labor share of GDP globally is at a record low. The profit share is at a record high. So anytime you have a policy, make sure it's not simply increasing profits. What you really want it to do is increase investment and reinvestment back into the economy. So this, third huge problem that can be looked at in different ways. We need to see this very much as an outcome of business practices themselves. And fourth, huge problem, again, probably one of the biggest problems we have now. And of course, it's also connected to the current health pandemic. If you look at some of the sources of the virus itself, I don't have to tell you what the problem is, but we should remember that we have very little time left to solve this climate problem. The IPCC report reminded us of that. This was now written 2 years ago, so we just have 9 years left to reach the targets that we've, are aiming at. But the problem is we're not getting there. Just last year, 2019, subsidies to fossil fuel companies in the US were over $20 billion, and in Europe, $55 billion. And a lot of the recovery scheme packages globally, at least those that are going to the business community, are very much still actually fueling industries and projects that are fossil fuel based. So we're simply not changing. We're not changing definitely at the pace that we require, but also we're not seeing it enough at the center of how government relates to businesses. And lastly, and this is the end of the depressing bit, I promised to get to the positive bit in a while, the state has a real problem, yeah? And I said markets are the outcomes of how public and private are governed and how they interrelate. I already mentioned that I think one of the biggest problems we have within the state is that it's been convinced through both economic theory, new public management, public choice theory, that the role of policy is to fix a market failure. And it's not that you don't have these market failures, we have them. They come about because of the positive externality issue where you have goods whose benefits are so wide that you have underinvestment in the business community in it, for example, basic research. So the state has to fund that, fine. Negative externalities, companies don't incorporate the cost of pollution, so government should at least, hopefully, try to fix that with a carbon tax. You have asymmetric information, so small companies are not getting the loans they require from banks, so you might have government bringing in SME finance. So all these things matter, they're very important, but the problem is if you just view them as a bandage to a failure, you then are always reactive, and you will by definition be too little, too late, right? So what we absolutely require is a new approach. And what I'd like to do in terms of arguing for this new approach is to give you a bit of a whirlwind tour in some of the arguments I've now been arguing for some years. And apologies if this looks a bit self-promotional, but academics do write books and they have to sell them. But no, forget the sales. The point is, what I would like to do is bring you through some of the key ideas, the big picture ideas in my recent writings around this problem, which is, what's the problem? We need a new direction. We have the 17 goals. We have to have investment-led, not consumption-led growth. We need to be serious with the Green Deal. But what does it mean? What do we do? So in my first work, I focused a lot on the role of the state itself in terms of its entrepreneurial role, to bring the state away from being, as I heard the Prime Minister say, away from being a lender of last resort towards an investor first resort, and looked at what that actually meant in places that have actually grown through innovation, or regions, right? So in the US, on aggregate, it's not growing through innovation, but there was a particular place, Silicon Valley, which many have written about. And if you unpick what happened there, you really see an incredibly active role of the state throughout the whole innovation chain, which has been really misunderstood. So many of the lessons that people try to learn from the Silicon Valley region fail miserably on their faces, including in the UK where I live. We have Silicon Roundabout in the east part of London. And this idea that we have great science, we just need some venture capital and then stir it up as a minestrone soup doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because if you don't have the whole decentralized network of different types of state institutions across the whole innovation chain, then it doesn't, the magic doesn't happen. And what does it mean to look at those state institutions as co-creating value alongside the private sector, but especially creating additionality, getting things to happen that would not have happened anyway? That means don't just do subsidies, handouts, and guarantees, right? The design of the policymaking across that whole innovation chain is central, and I'll try to give you some insights on the key points there. And more recently, I talked about value, that this has to be accompanied by a new story. Plato said, storytellers rule the world. We need a new story about not only the state, but how value is created, where wealth creation comes from. And I must say that in many parts of the world where you have progressive governments, including, of course, in the state of Palestine, there's been too much emphasis on redistribution as the progressive agenda. We need just as much emphasis and just as much progressive storytelling on where does wealth creation happen from in the first place. Otherwise, any even progressive tax policy will not be resting on a solid foundation of a progressive story about wealth creation itself. And in that sense, we need pre-distribution, not just redistribution. Get the conditions right in the first place. And then I want to focus on, in the last part of the lecture, this notion of missions and purpose. As I mentioned in the beginning, the corporate community has caught on to this word, purpose this, purpose that, as a new way to structure corporate governance. But I believe that purpose fundamentally has to be embedded within the contracts, within the system, at the center of the capitalist system itself, in terms of how the different value creating actors interact. And I will advocate for a mission-oriented approach to do that. And with some examples globally, and I'm very keen, especially in the Q&A, to talk to you about the relevance for the state of Palestine. And I'm currently finishing a book that's coming out in January called Mission Economy, which is sort of a blueprint. It says, well, what has to happen inside organizations? If you have an innovation fund, an innovation agency, a public bank, what does it mean actually to make it very explicit that this organization is mission-oriented and market co-creating and not market fixing? What does it mean for the organizational culture? What does it mean for the way that procurement contracts are written to have less of a skewed power relationship and self-confidence within the state institutions? But especially, what does it mean for working together towards some of the biggest problems of our time? Okay, so those three big areas, the state, value, and purpose, is what I'll talk about. And I have a lot of time left, just under 30 minutes, so I will make sure I don't go over time. So first, let's do the entrepreneurial state part of the story, because it really is about kind of different pieces of a puzzle, and we can't just focus on one bit of it. So let me just go through the key points here, which is, stupid assumptions get stupid answers. If we continue to pretend that value is created in business and the state is there to facilitate, to enable to de-risk, the word I probably hate the most. The state is de-risking who? The risk takers. Where would you prefer to work? On the left with the risk takers who do all the creative thinking, or on the right with the de-riskers? Of course on the left, if that's how it's framed, right? So if you're just de-risking, enabling, facilitating, these are all good words, by the way. These aren't the Tea Party words. The Tea Party would say, get the state out of the way. These are positive, progressive words. Enabling, facilitating, de-risking, fixing markets. This is all part of the problem. The language is boring. The language is inertial. The language, by definition, doesn't set us up to tackle these fundamental directed challenges that I talked about in the beginning. And there's plenty of propaganda around this theory, and there's no better place than The Economist to find it, where governments, yes, of course they're important. You must invest in education. You must invest in infrastructure, in research, but then please get the hell out of the way so the revolutionaries can do their job. Now, I want to repeat here, of course we need to invest in education. Of course we need to invest in research. Of course we need to have proper infrastructure. But if we frame it that this is about enabling value creation in business, this is my critique. It's not that we shouldn't be investing in the basics. The problem is this notion that then that is just the basic stuff in the background, and you need to level the playing field, and somehow then everything will happen fine in business. This doesn't actually get us the kind of changes we require, especially in countries that are having real problems around their development pathway, their innovation pathway, and this idea that just get the basics and somehow the market will take care of the rest. And there's no better place to kind of see why this is a myth than precisely those places that have in fact spurred some of the greatest innovation, where it'd be impossible to explain historically the way that big technological changes happened, from mass production to advances in aeronautics to more recently the clean technology revolution, if we saw them simply through the lens of a market fixing state. What all of these different general purpose technologies required, in other words, the technologies that fundamentally change production, distribution, and consumption, was a much more active, decentralized, entrepreneurial state across the whole chain, including on the demand side, right? The demand side policies are critical. So Carlota Perez, a wonderful academic who is an honorary professor in the institute I run here in London, she has often argued that mass production itself would never have had the effect that it did have across the whole economy around the globe had there not been, for example, policies around suburbanization, right? That didn't happen just out of the blue. That was coming from demand side policies, which then became a funnel through which diffusion and full deployment of the mass production revolution happened. And in this sense, green policies today shouldn't just be about financing and investing in renewable energy or kind of changes in manufacturing, but just as much on demand side demand pull green policies, which can become a funnel for the ICT revolution to get fully deployed and diffused. Anyway, so in the entrepreneurial state, I unpicked the iPhone and said, if you don't like this story, then throw away any of your smart products, because in fact, everything that makes our smart products smart and not stupid were actually publicly financed. And yes, this was mainly through Cold War financing. And most of my talk today will be on the non-Cold War financing or Cold War missions, but the Sustainable Development Goal missions. But let's just pause and admit that everything that makes this smart was in fact financed by the public sector. And on top of that, in public institutions that were organized in a particular way. They did not see their role as just incentivizing, the big tech companies. So the internet, GPS, touchscreen, the Siri voice activated system were all financed by the public institutions like DARPA, which financed the internet. But the most interesting thing is the internet was financed not because anyone said we need the internet, but because there was a problem to be solved. And the problem that had to be solved, that the internet solved, was getting the satellites to communicate. Or GPS, which was financed from the US Navy, didn't come about because someone said we need GPS, but they actually required the global positioning system type of technology in order to know much more precisely where the different ships were in the ocean, but also for wartime, for the wartime machinery. And there's so little known about these organizations. You know, what is the culture of risk-taking within these organizations? How is a portfolio set up so you don't put all your eggs in one basket? So if you fail in one thing, the whole thing comes crumbling down. What does it mean for flexibility, adaptability? In fact, one of the secrets behind DARPA, which again financed the internet, was that it knew, you know, it wasn't just about turning the tap on for investment, but also knowing when to turn it off. So that kind of mix between being long-termist, but also being flexible and adaptable, having metrics, what's working, what's not. And if you look at the actual, you know, statements, even just on the websites of these organizations that were so critical in the US at least, for you know, really galvanizing that investment-led growth, they never use the word market fixing. And then when they're analyzed by the analysts, including by the finance ministries, that's when you start hearing all the market fixing propaganda. But just look at the websites. It's all about catalyzing, creating breakthrough technologies, or in different public banks that have been very important for the clean transition, the green transition, like the KfW, a public bank in Germany, the European Investment Bank, BNDES, which is a public bank in Brazil. You know, the language is about changing the market space, catalyzing private activity in it through crowding in through public sector leadership. And also your own Palestinian Investment Fund, which I started looking into a bit. I'm in no way an expert on Palestine, but I was very curious when you invited me to give this lecture. You know, its own statement is absolutely to be investing, to be mobilizing, to be catalyzing, to be strategic, and by definition then should have, you'll have to tell me how well it's doing, a portfolio approach. So that kind of investor first resort thinking. And yet the economists, when we have our beautiful econometric models, there's never a dummy variable that says, was the money just being handed out randomly, or was there a mission-oriented plan? And if so, you know, what happened? So if this matters, we should be looking at that. And we know it matters, but we don't look at it. And so, you know, what's very important is also to admit that this is not just about one agency, but I've already said before, what was very important and is very important in countries, including China today, which I think is really leading in many ways around the new revolution around green technology, is it's not about one institution, but a distributed network, a decentralized network of state institutions across the whole innovation chain. So basic research, of course, applied research, of course, feedback between basic and applied through organizations like the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany. They've been very important. And more downstream, this is where often people don't understand how important it is, the patient, long-term, committed finance to the few companies that are even interested in innovating. It's simply not true that every company out there wants to innovate. And if they do want to innovate, often the time lags, the lead times, the time it takes is very long. Even Death Valley, the famous Death Valley stage, can be 10 or 15 years. And so because venture capital, which is the private finance that in theory is supposed to be, you know, catalyzing, say, small, medium enterprises, tends to be quite risk averse and especially exit driven. By risk averse, I mean never coming in really, really early stage when the risk is the highest, but a bit later stage, but is very exit driven, wanting to exit, say, in 5 years through an IPO or a buyout. You know, that exit driven financial model for small companies has created disasters in areas like biotechnology. So often what's been required is patient long-term finance from the public sector to those companies, and only later, once they start to, you know, be taking off, the VC industry has come in to help them. And in fact, in the US, what's been very interesting is the private venture capital industry has used the public kind of venture capital industry, like the SBIR program, as a filter through which to know which companies are worth investing in, because the public sector actually allowed, you know, came in much earlier and took on the higher risk, and those companies that receive that finance are often on the back of that get the private VC. In Israel, there was Yozma, you know this, the public venture capital fund. In America, the biggest public venture capital fund is InQtel inside the CIA. Very few people know about that. I mentioned SBIR, which is interesting because it occurs through procurement. So 3% of the budget of every ministry in America, the departments, is set aside for small, medium enterprises to be procured in for areas that the different departments need, from health, energy, defense. But there's also global banks, public banks, like the European Investment Bank, the Asian Investment Bank, which increasingly are focusing not just on infrastructure and capital development, but on that kind of VC financing, especially in areas that are seen as really strategic and important, like the green transition. And they're basically public venture capital funds within these public banks. And again, your own Palestinian Investment Fund being one of a very interesting pot of money that could be seen through that lens. And even more downstream, I mentioned, of course, we have, demand side policies, which are very important. And what's absolutely then required for this shift in mindset to, get outside of this notion that this is just about fixing failures is also really to change the language. I'm always surprised by these great, policies and white papers and green papers that come out about ambitious goals, just how much of the language remains not ambitious. And I really think that the language needs to change away from fixing to co-creating, away from de-risking to taking on risks together, sharing risks and sharing rewards. And that really means to welcome uncertainty, but not to pretend that one fund is de-risking another one. Yeah, sharing risks also then leads to how do we share the rewards? Again, a concept I'll come to later. We need to get away from this idea that we're leveling the playing field. We need to tilt it towards a green transition. We need to tilt it towards SDGs. But tilting doesn't mean to pick winners, so pick one firm, one sector, one technology. You really need to pick a direction, a broad direction, like a green transition, and within that have a portfolio of different, diverse projects. And of course, different countries at different levels of development might structure those differently, but for sure not putting all your eggs in one basket, but also making sure that the idea is to structure the policies that really then allow you to pick the willing. Who's willing to engage with a certain region on some of the most ambitious goals you have, whether it's green or reducing the digital divide, and using the policy levers to pick those who are willing. And really being careful about this huge trend that we've seen globally in outsourcing of government brains. The dynamic capabilities required inside the public sector in some ways have been diminished precisely because we pretended the point was just to fix markets. Well, what is the skills you need to fix markets? That's very different from the skills we need to be an active value creating institution. So we need to build capacity, not outsource. And we need also the metrics. I'll come to this a bit at the end, different metrics to even know whether you succeeded or not. So if it's about market shaping and not market fixing, what is the evaluation exercise that's required to measure what you've done, to evaluate whether it's successful? And these old ways of doing it through cost benefit analysis and net present value, they would have stopped any sort of ambitious project from the start, right? I mean, I'll come later to the moon landing. Believe me, the Apollo project would have never started had it been seen through a cost benefit analysis. So we need dynamic metrics which really capture, for example, all the spillovers that happen along the way. And this quote by Confucius, who obviously was extremely smart, is a wonderful quote. He says, if language is not correct, then what is said is not what is meant. And if what is said is not what is meant, then what must be done remains undone. If this remains undone, morals and art will deteriorate. If justice goes astray, the people will stand about in helpless confusion. And I really believe this is true. Even in countries where they have had the entrepreneurial state institutions. I spoke this morning, by the way, to the South Korean government. And so I think that's very interesting, given that Mas, I see, was also given funds from Korea. And even in Korea or in the US, where they have had the entrepreneurial state institutions, if the language doesn't change, there's not enough learning within the country, let alone between the country and other countries. There's not enough sharing, being very open about what the challenges and opportunities are to change course. And I once actually spoke to the chief scientific officer in Israel, and he said to me, Mariana, of course we know what you're talking about. Of course we are, creating and shaping markets, but please just let us use the old language so no one bothers us. Pretend we're just fixing markets. That way we can just go on our job. And that's exactly what the US did, actually. They were creating markets, but continued to use the language of market fixing. And so even though some random individuals who set up programs knew sort of the truth, it wasn't then shared. It didn't become systemic. And this is, by the way, why I'm working very closely now with the BBC, with our team and my institute, because the BBC as a public broadcaster has been open about these questions about public value. What does it mean to create value inside the BBC and to be willing, for example, to invest even in soap operas and talk shows, not just documentaries, you know, and high quality news? What are the decisions that you would make as a public entity to do a soap opera? So the fact they did soap operas on working class people and EastEnders, and not just Dallas and Dynasty, like the US classic soap opera, that was very much fueled by intra-organizational debates about value creation. And they tried to measure it, but unfortunately it hasn't been as codified as it could have been. And so that's, you know, the project we're doing with them now, but language really does matter. So moving on, the reason, you know, that I focused actually on value in my other book called The Value of Everything was very much about this idea of, you know, stories and language. Because my experience was that even the countries that understood the entrepreneurial state kind of message still were using then the wrong language and weren't debunking this fundamental idea about where value came from. They somehow were still, you know, they thought the state was important, you needed an innovation agency, but then it didn't actually affect the narrative about the wealth creation process itself. As I mentioned, you know, Plato saying storytellers rule the world, we really need to unpick that. You know, because the stories we tell of where production happens, how value is created, who creates value, et cetera, are fundamental. And so I don't have time to go into the details, but what I wrote about in the book was, you know, actually the stories we've told about value have changed drastically over time, often linked to what was happening in the economy. So, you know, the mercantilists, this was in the years of the Navigation Acts, you know, thought in some ways, like Trump has thought recently, that, you know, value occurs through exchange. And so build the walls or focus on the terms of trade and exchange rates. But very then, you know, soon after that, both the physiocrats in the 1700s and the classical economists in the 1800s focused on an objective concept of value tied to the production structures of the time. So the physiocrats really thought that farming and agriculture, because of the time, was the source of value. And we're very interested in knowing how that value was being circulated in the economy and what was happening if some value was getting siphoned out, thinking back to my early slides. The classicals similarly, and I'll go through this in a minute, but the big change has happened with modern economic thinking, where the focus is no longer on objective conditions, but subjective. Everything is about personal preferences, right? Individuals are maximizing their utility, firms are maximizing their profits, even workers are seen to be maximizing their decisions of labor versus work, leisure versus work. And you sum up all those individual decisions and get your supply and demand curves. And where those curves meet, that's the equilibrium price, and that reveals value, right? So the big change we had from the early kind of physiocrats and classicals to the neoclassicals is the logic swapped. The logic went from one where they focused on value and asked a lot of questions about that, and that became their theory of price, or it had an implication for the theory of price, to the opposite. We simply today have a theory of price, and anything that has a price is assumed to be valued, whether it's the price being charged by a hedge fund, credit default swap, or, you know, something else. It doesn't matter. It's just we look at the prices and then derive the values. And I think this is a fundamental problem in our current system, and we have to debunk that as much as we have to debunk the early issues I talked about in terms of what is the state even for. So I'll just say quickly, these guys, they all look the same. Kane, look, he looks just like Adam Smith here, all guys in white wigs. Kane, you know, basically made the first spreadsheet ever, the tableau économique. And what's so interesting about this, I kind of made it easier to look at here, is they were very concerned about the circulation of value. So if too much money was being siphoned out by the sterile class, who they thought were both the merchants and the landlords, then they really thought that the reproduction of the system itself would be at risk, and that's why they use this strong word of sterility. And so the landlords, by just fueling their own luxurious lifestyle, were putting the reproduction of the system at risk, because that money was not getting reinvested back in production to make the land more valuable and productive. And similarly with Adam Smith, everyone knows his book, The Wealth of Nations, and that's very much a story about the need for reinvestment, okay, not siphoning out, reinvestment back into making the organization of production, the division of labor more productive. His famous pin factory example here was an example of that. But, you know, what's so interesting with Smith is people associate him with the concept of the free market. There's, you know, it's not only because he also wrote this stuff on morality, because that's also, you know, a good example of where he wasn't just worried about the free market, but even in this more technical bit of his work, the free market for him was free from rent, not free from the state. He was worried about rent extraction, which he saw as robbery, right? Landlord's right has its origin in robbery, he said. The landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed and demand a rent even for natural produce of the earth. So again, think back to the real estate market that we were talking about before. But this complete misconception about what Adam Smith was about, you know, really needs to hopefully be corrected one day in all economics departments. But the interesting thing in the classicals was, again, that they had this objective, not deterministic, but objective glance on the economy in terms of the production, who's doing what and why, and how is that linked to who's getting what and why, right? The link between production and income being earned, but also power issues. They didn't look at, you know, workers' preferences for leisure versus work, but also the class struggle itself as being a key component of what the wages were. And this notion of rent as unearned income. And so what happens then in this confusion that occurs in modern economic thought is we end up confusing price with value. And so the whole notion even of what's the difference between rent and profit becomes very confused. And so what I do in the book, which I can't do here, is I go through all the different reasons why this actually matters. It determines, you know, our theory of inequality, who earns what and why, what we include in GDP. As long as it has a price, we put it in. How we govern organizations, the whole issue of shareholder value is affected by this value theory, how we price essential products, value-based pricing for medicines, etc. But I want to focus on is just that last bullet point to have some continuity in this discussion. How we understand the role of the state, of course, gets affected by this, because if you think about it, so many of the best things we get from public sector investment have often been free, right? So public education, public health, at least in countries that have that, many countries unfortunately don't. And if we don't even, you know, if we don't know how to value those things that are free because they don't have a price, by definition, we will only always look at them as an expenditure. You know, this word government spending or expenditure as opposed to investment, capital investment, seeing the needed investment in public education and public health as an investment in the long run, a capital investment in the long run to make our economies more inclusive, sustainable, resilient, et cetera, is undermined by how we actually look at value, as well as the policymaking process, as I've said, being framed as just fixing markets. And also the reason I set up a whole institute in London around these issues is I really believe that we need a new curriculum for civil servants. So not one based on public choice theory and new public management. Moving on, let me just move on a bit more quickly here. So third, my last part of this talk in the last 6 minutes I have is what do we then do? You know, we can't just sit there and complain and say economic theory is terrible and you have all these big problems as the ones that I mentioned. We need a solution. And I think this idea, which again is out there in the Davos setting, purpose this, purpose that. Let's make this serious. What does it mean to have a purpose-driven economy around the biggest problems that we have in our neighborhoods, on our streets, in our cities, in our regions, in our countries, and globally? And for this reason, I've been using the word missions and moon landing, or sorry, moonshot, but really it's about an earth shot. And it's about unpicking what it actually meant to face globally as a huge public-private enterprise, one of the hardest things as humanity we ever did, get to the moon and back again. But then to bring it literally to our streets, to our schools, what does it mean to be incredibly ambitious around the goal and to have an outcomes-oriented policymaking process, to be actively risk-taking and asking what it means for our internal organizations to do that, but also to really form symbiotic and not parasitic partnerships. And, you know, going to the moon was not just NASA, it was just, you know, it wasn't just aeronautics. There was so much investment and across many sectors. Nutrition, what the astronauts ate inside to get up to the moon mattered. What they wore, so investment in materials, nutrition, electronics, software, huge amounts of investment in the software area, which really took its shape from that. The idea is, let's start with the SDGs. And again, I really applaud you as a region of the world who've started to really take them seriously. Start with the SDGs as the big challenges, transform them into concrete missions. So problems you can actually say, yes or no, did you achieve it? But do so in such a way that's not siloed, but is really intersectoral. That requires lots of different sectors in your economy, from the social services to digital, to the creative sector, to transport, nutrition, etc. And then, this is key, design your tools, procurement, grants, loans, prize schemes that really foster that bottom-up investment in innovation to get there, to solve that problem. So, take SDG 14 on climate change. Any sort of carbon neutrality for a city, for example, would by definition include investment in energy, construction, food, mobility, the social sector. And the projects could be anything from citizen carbon ID cards, carbon neutral urban food industry, clean urban electric mobility, buildings with carbon absorbing components. So instead of seeing climate change as a renewable energy problem, or at best a couple sectors having to change what they're doing, really focusing on very ambitious problems that require really all your sectors to transform. But the design question is key. I was really impressed in recent years when the German public bank changed how it gave out the loans to include conditionality, so that the steel sector, which globally always asked for help, could only get the loan they wanted if they committed to reducing their material content. And today the German steel industry is one of the most innovative because it applied repurpose, reuse, and recycle to their whole value chain. But not because they went to Davos and were told to do that, because they had to in order to get the loan. So the missions have to be bold and inspirational, and ideally chosen by citizens together. It should not be a top-down moment like the Kennedy moonshot. This is about getting citizens in regions in Palestine to talk together about the problems, and to really then use that to inform and design areas like industrial strategy and innovation problem to be about citizen focused problems, and to design, again, the tools to drive the multiple bottom-up solutions. These, by the way, these two reports, there's this first one and then another one called Governing Missions, is the work I did with the European Union. It was voted on, believe it or not, by the Parliament and the Council. So missions today in Europe are a legal instrument to direct the innovation, not around a sector, a technology, a siloed project, but some of the biggest problems really that Europe is facing today. So I was very happy to see this. And what we've been doing recently, besides thinking about these implementation issues that I mentioned already, is also then applying it. Sorry, this was something I saw in the literature and preparing for this, that you've, again, not only been thinking through these SDGs, but also thinking through what it means for your own innovation trajectory and industrial trajectory. Let's come back to this later. But what we've done in the UK was then to inform the strategy, for example, for industrial policy to be focused around 4 big problems like future mobility, aging, clean growth, and then to help the government really think through what that, again, cross-sectoral, cross-sector, and bottom-up process might look like. And this is just an example for future of mobility, where we looked at innovations in transport, inclusive design, creative sector, urban planning, and those many different projects that you have to really welcome that level of risk-taking to get there. Also doing it at the level of communities, like in Camden, part of London, we've been focusing on the housing estates, on social housing. This is something I think would be so interesting to talk with you about, given the housing question, of course, in the state of Palestine, to use your housing and your social housing as funnels through which you drive a carbon neutral agenda. So it's not just protecting citizens' rights to have housing, but then using that as to funnel the innovation itself across all sorts of areas. I think would be fascinating to talk to you about. But also the institutions themselves. The work we did in Scotland and some other countries, including the European Investment Bank, has been make sure you design your public funds, like your PIF or a public bank, not to be a handout machine, but to be a machine that is providing patient long-term finance to those companies or organizations that are willing to engage with you on your biggest public problems and missions. And so having the state have an agency that is really catalytic and has conditionality attached to it. I had more slides, but I really want us to have time for questions. So I think I should probably just stop. Let me just quickly show you, this was the work we did with the EIB. And just quickly, in Italy, the work I'm doing with the Prime Minister is focused on Europe currently. This, I don't think people appreciate this as much. The recovery plan for for Europe, is for the first time conditional, not on austerity, but on investment around climate and digitalization. And I've noticed in also looking at your own reports on the digital divide and digitalization question in Palestine, this is an area that's very important to you. But what's interesting in Europe is that even though we have now a recovery fund that's conditional on investment, the capacity on the ground across the member states is not there. We don't have the right ways we do the procurement or that we think about budgeting. We don't do outcomes-based budgeting. How can we have an outcomes-based policy if we don't do outcomes-based budgeting? So, all these issues of the how are very important. I will stop there. I'll stop there so we have time for questions. Apologies, I had too many slides, but I think all these issues are ones that I would love for us to be able to continue, interacting with also after this lecture, maybe in workshops.
I hope you heard the welcome and thanks very much from the hall. عندي الآن 4-5 متحدثين حبوا يطرحوا أو يعقبوا. ممكن اختصار مداخلاتكم لو سمحتوا دقيقتين. If you wish to present to speak in Arabic or in English, where is the microphone, please? Okay, تفضل. سمير حليلي تفضل. سمير حليلي well, you can take the
Hello.
تفضل. Yes, go on.
Shukran. Thank you very much for your presentation, and really it's challenging, extremely interesting. I was just thinking, what comes first? Was it the 2008-2012 crisis in the world that has created such questions, big ones, as you have mentioned, facing public policy, governments, in particular in Europe after 2012 and before that in the US? Because I have a very strong feeling within the private sector, big corporations even in the world. I know it in the G20 and G7 and 8, they are having a special commission discussing the same kind of questions vis-a-vis the private sector, not the governments. In particular, the private sector in the world is extremely worried that whatever they do, whatever they produce, still lack of stability is the name of the game. Poverty is still extremely widespread. And what's more important is that poverty and wealth are becoming very much deeper with all the value of products and wealth that we are creating. So basically, we need, even as private sector and without any direction coming from governments and policymakers, we need ourselves to creating a value and not just profits for our shareholders. And that's where impact investment came as a model in the last 5 or 7 years, starting with the UK, but also now all over the world. In Israel, I know it's there. And even in Palestine, we have 2 or 3 cases of impact investment where private sector money is invested in public purpose, meaning in creating a purpose that goes beyond just creating profit. My question to you, are we talking about 2 different issues? What governments should do, what private sector should do, and where can they both work together? Because I have a deeper concern about what governments are ready for that. When you speak about governments in Europe, I understand. When you speak maybe about US government, I don't know, maybe. But I have a lot of other doubts about if it's only open for all governments generically, without looking into who is ready more and what needs to make a government ready to intervene for a public purpose. Thank you.
شكرا سمير. ماهر المصري تفضل, your comments, your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is an interesting lecture and we value it very much. I do agree in general with the role of the government in growth and development. So in theory, this is all right, and it has been practiced across the world in variances and with different proportions of successes here and there. Now, what I am interested in is really to look at the case of the developing countries, including Palestine, which is one of them, and see how much is that applicable in our cases, because what we need to do is really try to superimpose this general policy onto these countries which do lack a lot of the basic elements that are conducive to such intervention and a positive intervention in the economy. And we can say about Palestine, just you have mentioned about our investment fund, Palestine Investment Fund, and the government's role. These are names that do some work here. The issue is how much of that is really impacting the economy in terms of benchmarks, effect, and actual practice that goes in line with the purpose of that intervention. That is the public value built in that service from the government to the private sector and to the economy at large. This is the question. And I haven't seen yet throughout the studies and the books that were written in the past centuries and even now, how much of that depends on the right governance from the government side or its agencies in really bringing that impact and effect into the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Masri. Another question or two, and then we'll revert to Professor Mazzucato. Majda Salim, تفضلي.
Well, thank you for your original thoughts. My question is more of a macro question, and it refers to your original, like some of your lectures, you said you talked about the money tree, which is the money supply in the market. And today you presented it in the first global problem, which is the financial financing problem. My question is, how do you think the world or the emerging markets and central banks in the emerging markets should react to the creation of money that has been like the US, the central bank, the European Central Bank, and others are doing through the world, while others, they can't do that?
Thank you, Majda. One or two more, Samir Salame, and then Dr. Nabil, or here. Okay. Last two, please.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mariano, for very interesting lecture. I was listening carefully as government official to what you said. I have very direct question. Maybe my question is rephrasing Dr. Samir Rihlele a question. I'm thinking as a government here in Palestine to taking into consideration the situation we are living as a government under occupation. We don't have any authority over our resources. 2/3 of our land where the resources is available is fully under the control of the occupation authority. My question, how could the government play the role of market creator rather than market fixer, taking into consideration Palestine case? Thank you.
Dr. Nabil Assis, please, تفضل.
Thank you very much for this rich lecture. There's a lot of food for thought there.
Yeah.
But I have a question regarding topical issue. Our current companies law does not allow buyback of shares. And there's a strong drive by some big corporates, or the bigger corporates here, pushing for allowing that. Could you please elaborate on the downside of that while the government is listening? Thank you.
One final question from Haytham Zarbit.
Thank you for this enlightening and really informative lecture. As a lawyer, I would like you to comment on the role of the independent judiciary in supporting growth in economy, and whether this is one of the main blocks in your eyes. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's plenty for you to begin with, Professor, and then we'll take some Q&As from the audience.
Okay.
Go ahead, please,
Great.
Professor.
So sorry, I don't have all the names. I'll just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So thank you for the wonderful questions. And that's why I said this is hopefully just the beginning. You should have told me to speak just 20 minutes, not 50 minutes. So we had more time for questions. So the first one on purpose and impact investing, it's a very important question. I really think that's a positive change, that we have impact investing and the conversations, that has, caused. But my point is that's not going to cause change just by having impact investing or ESG targets, which are also very important in the corporate community. That alone, even when it's really well intentioned and even when it actually happens, often it doesn't happen, can't happen alone. That notion of purpose and impact, the point of my mission-oriented approach is that has to happen at the center of how public and private interact. And your point really was also about, are the states or the governments actually too weak? So what are we actually talking about? If there's more willingness to do this in the corporate community and the underlying government structures are too weak, where should the kind of emphasis be? And if you look at what happened with COVID-19, this wasn't like what really mattered in terms of government capacity to foster change was actually on the degree to which certain governments had even invested in the in-house capabilities that are required to govern and to manage change, drastic change, quick change like we need when we have a pandemic. So the region of Kerala in India and Vietnam, two, definitely not modern, completely developed countries, but still very much in their development trajectory, did a lot better than many developed countries like the UK, precisely because over the last decade or so, also due to their own internal challenges, including the Nipah virus, had made these investments inside state capacity. And I didn't get to that, apologies, because I was taking too long to get through my slides, but a lot of what I would have said at the end was that none of this will happen if you don't, if we have weak states, which because of the market failure idea, haven't been investing in their intra-organizational resources. So really the question is, what kind of capabilities, what kind of investment, what does it mean to make, a public entity, ambitious and mission-oriented so it also attracts some of the top talent? In the US, Steve Chu, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, was willing to head the Department of Energy, not because Obama said, oh, come here and de-risk Elon Musk, but because Obama said after the financial crisis, we're going to use $800 billion to steer the economy towards a green transition. It then didn't happen. I mean, I don't know if you remember what then happened. It didn't happen, but it was an honor for a Nobel Prize winning physicist to come in and help steer a transition in an economy. And in a much more local level, Kerala, or the example I gave of Denmark, what I think is interesting is that we all should learn from what works and what doesn't, both in the private sector and in the public sector. And if I skip ahead a minute to the question 5, the buyback thing doesn't work in the private sector. What that works is for short-term profits. If you want short-term profits and a short-term kind of speculative a model of capitalism, fine, allow your companies to do whatever they want. If you want to foster long-term growth, this isn't about using a stick and telling companies what to do. That's not going to work either. That will stifle innovation. But it is about building in, and again, I mentioned that I read that you do have, at least in theory, in the state of Palestine, you are one of the pioneers for trying, at least right now, to implement the 2030 agenda around the SDGs in a way that maps with governmental mechanisms. I'm not saying you've done that, but it's interesting how, for example, in Spain, there's a small region called Biscay where they've said we need to change how we do tax incentives for companies to help reward those companies that really are making the kind of changes that are required to move towards the SDGs. But again, the procurement structures that I mentioned, or the grants, that example I gave of Germany using its public bank loan to set a condition for whether you can access the public loan, that example of conditionality should be seen as both a carrot and a stick. And what was interesting with COVID is that some countries like France and Austria linked the bailouts to the companies to such transformations. In Denmark, they said, if you use, tax paradise, how do you call it? Evade your tax by using offsite, tax havens, you can't access the recovery. And Macron said that you can only access the recovery for Renault and Air France if they committed to reducing their carbon emissions. The second question around, Palestine and public value and the governance mechanisms. I mean, that's what I meant when I was talking about the BBC example. It's what we actually need are new metrics. So, and I had one slide where I would have shown you some of the new metrics we're working with, for example, in the UK around the Green Book. The Green Book currently is the way the UK government measures whether it should or should not make a public investment. And it's still very much wed to an old way of thinking of, again, cost-benefit analysis. So if you admit that a lot of your challenges will require experimentation, they will require risk-taking, and actually some of the benefits that come about in your region are as a spillover of that experimentation process, those kind of design thinking ways of embedding the experimentation mentality inside the government mechanisms are key. The third question on macro, I mean, really, I think what's interesting is that fits into the big global debate now on MMT. A good friend of mine, Stephanie Kelton, has been a leader on that, which is basically saying, we can create money. As long as you have a sovereign currency, as long as you have that, when you go to war, no one says, oh, we don't have the money to go, to Afghanistan or whatever. They just go. So in wartime scenarios, money's created. And the idea is, why don't we just admit that's how things work? And taxes are not so much needing to be raised in order to have the funding. Taxes are about creating the right incentives. So having a financial transaction tax, taxing material more than we tax labor, having the right capital gains tax instead of the wrong capital gains tax, all those things are correct in terms of creating the right behaviors. But governments with sovereign currencies, and we'll come to Palestine in a second, because you don't have autonomy in terms of your budget because of the occupation, et cetera, it's just a false problem. So if you actually really do the mission-oriented stuff that I'm talking about with a strong national innovation system, in theory, that increases your deficit in the short run because these things need spending in both the public and private sectors, but in the long run, it can foster growth. Debt to GDP remains in check, but the actual money that's released in the system can be created just like we create it when we go to war. So treating the climate emergency as a security problem, treating poverty and inequality with the same urgency, the war on poverty that we treat wars, in theory should be able to liberate money. And that is what we're seeing in Europe, and we saw it after the financial crisis. It just then didn't get steered in the right direction. And that's why monetary and fiscal policy have to go hand in hand. Otherwise, you create a lot of liquidity, a lot of cash, put it into the system, it has no place to stick, and it goes back to the financial sector. So this lack of ambitious fiscal policy, is often the problem, because then we're not creating the opportunities for investment through that. And the money that is released and created, finds itself in very dodgy areas. The fourth question around the occupation is your biggest problem. And you don't need me to tell you that. And I'm definitely not an expert, but this is why in your case, it makes, it's even more important to get this right. And again, this is where I'd love to be speaking to you more later, but when you, how can I say, there's all sorts of different ways in which to set up strategic funds that are both very broad in terms of your broader developmental challenges, but also quite specific if one thought about, say, your digitalization agenda. But having funds where the rewards to those funds are plowed back in are critical, right? So this idea of sharing both risks and rewards that I mentioned under the value piece, a public investment fund is very different from other types of government funding, because you're not just, kind of funding the downside, you're also getting the upside. And this is where, even the US, which is, again, advanced capitalist countries, got it completely wrong. They keep bailing out, in the bad periods and then letting the good stuff just go private. That happened both with the Goldman Sachs bailout, but also how they funded innovation. They gave the same amount of money to Tesla, which is successful, and to Solyndra, which went bankrupt. The government found itself bailing out Solyndra and getting nothing from Tesla. And that whole story, I've written about it quite a bit, was a disaster. But what I think is very interesting, if you have your own wealth funds and public investments, is by setting it up like a portfolio, it can, replenish its own, pot. And I think thinking through that strategically, talking to countries like Singapore and others, and Malaysia, who've done this quite well, and getting advice on how to structure it, I think that's a very important, and I'm sure you're doing this, by the way, but anyway, that's why these strategic public investment funds are so important. I mentioned already the fifth question on no buyback, don't do it. It doesn't mean no buybacks at all, but how they have been abused since the 1980s is a huge warning sign. And just the fact that these big global companies are now feeling so guilty about it and talking about stakeholder value and looking at the share buybacks as having been one of the key problems should be a warning sign to you. Don't be catching up in the wrong way. And the independent judiciary, I mean, it's very important, of course. Markets are embedded in law and institutions and rules, and it's often just the wrong one. So there's a great book out called The Code of Capital by Katerina Pistor. I recommend you read that. Very much looking at how actually a lot of the inequality that many countries have experienced around some of the issues I mentioned, including socialization of risk, privatization of rewards, has been embedded within the legal codes of what, of even what a corporation is in terms of limited liability and else. So I just think there's two different issues here. One is having an independent judiciary, which of course is important, but the other thing is admitting the legal relationships are key. And often we have the wrong legal kind of rules of the game. And if we want to unpick the role of the corporation in modern capitalism, we actually need a new legal code as well.
Okay, I know we're going to have to make a quick, a hard break in less than 10 minutes. There have been so many issues we've covered, a bit of a whirlwind, but I want to add a few more questions from the audience, if you don't mind. And
sure.
Then you'll have another 5 minutes, and if you can see what you can say about the first one. How can a state, which you've touched on, but let's go back to it maybe, how can a state that is resource constrained lead in directing innovation? Do we need to start with investing in building public sector capacity? That's the first one. Second one, the public sector has financed research on the COVID vaccines, yet big pharma will be the ones that profit from it. How can the state and taxpayers ensure that we get a proper return on our investment? A third one, again, everybody's worried about the state. What should the state do with monopolies and Amazon, like Amazon, that exert too much control on capital and the economy globally? If I may, there's one final fourth one. In its statehood development literature, Palestine's government strategy called for a transition to a knowledge-based economy in the past, but now it seems that we are in a transition to an innovation economy, one that has foreign language that old guards are not accustomed to, e.g. inclusiveness, pick the willing, co-creation. How can the Palestinian government and society leap to the innovation economy? So I'll leave you with those four, and thank you very much. And we know you have something very urgent to attend to, so we'll call it a break after your last. Tfaddal. Go ahead.
And you'll have to invite me back in person, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first and the last one actually in some ways can be answered together, which is, if you don't have the public sector capacity, basically nothing then happens. In fact, what we've seen in many even advanced industrialized countries is because they don't have that capacity, they end up outsourcing a lot of the solutions to, God forbid, the McKinseys of the world, but more than that, the big, global consulting companies, or just other organizations in the UK, for example, Serco and GDS get all the public contracts. And that creates this vicious cycle of, we have the wrong framing of the state, so the state doesn't invest in its own capacity, and then it becomes weak, it becomes unable, so it has to end up, overly relying on other actors to kind of do its job. And I think, you're not going to have a knowledge-based economy. You're not going to have an innovation-driven economy without both private and public. Hence, that first question on the first round was so important. The private sector, of course, has to undergo change and is in some ways leading some of the change. But that same idea of purpose-driven and being capable, dynamic, adaptable, flexible, outcomes-oriented is so central within state institutions. But even the curriculum's not there, even in countries that have the wealth to fund it. And hence the reason I've set up a whole institute around those ideas, and we have a education program around it. But the kind of missions and innovation that I was starting to get to at the end around the digital divide, around using social housing estates as the vehicles through which you think about carbon neutrality. So it's not just carbon neutral city, but carbon neutral social housing. Sweden, by the way, has a fossil-free welfare state mission, which then it's landed in their school system through the school meal strategy, right? So having school meals as the focus, as the place through which your innovation around the supply chain of food happens is so interesting. So, a healthy, sustainable, tasty, not IKEA meatballs, a lunch in school meals in Sweden is such a concrete mission, which is even more important in countries, in developing countries, where often the school meal is the only meal that some kids get, right? So this shouldn't be seen as the big moonshot, this is just about big tech and, aeronautics. This is about life. That's why I began with the SDGs. The SDGs are all about well-being, but they're too broad. They're really important, but they're very broad. So turning those into really concrete things for what does it mean for a street, literally street policy. Sweden has 40,000 kilometers of streets, and they have now street level missions, school meal missions. This to me seems, a really interesting place to begin in your region, also because of the, poverty issues, and using the welfare state itself, the public health, public education, public transport as vehicles through which public and private solve problems together, and you steer it both with the agenda, but also with these instruments that we were talking about before are key. The vaccine I've written about endlessly. I've written many articles on this. 40 billion a year is what the US government spends on health innovation, and then they just give it away. The patent system is not governed with the public good in mind. So the patents are too broad, they're too deep, and they're too upstream. So they're used to extract rents, and that's really a crime, not only because it ends up preventing people to have access to the drugs, but also because the government, has funded it. So it's stupid. It's stupid, and it's a crime. And the vaccine, the fact we're racing so quickly to one, it's important because speed matters. But we have to, the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros has been calling for a patent pool. He calls it a people's vaccine. And the idea is that you would govern the innovation process with this notion of collective intelligence in mind, and that really needs to inform how we govern the intellectual property rights, which again have been misgoverned through just a market failure idea. If you say that this is about shaping markets to be inclusive, how you govern the patent system would be very different. And the drug that's out there right now as a therapy, not a vaccine, is remdesivir. It's being sold by Gilead for over $3,200 per dosage. And it was mainly funded by the public sector. So again, it's just endless, the problems here. On Amazon and big tech, one of the slides I didn't get through was one looking at what's happened in Barcelona in Spain. One of the, my points has been, don't just think of this ex post. You can't just worry about tax of big tech or the privacy concerns with big tech. We need new structures. So the city of Barcelona has done something fascinating, which is to bring in hackers, computer hackers, into the city government. This is something you should try. In order for the data that's created, every time you click on your apps, you're creating data. to make sure the city is able to govern, manage, and proactively govern the data that's created to improve public transport and different sort of public needs. That required a new institution, a new capacity. And it was amazing when they announced it, and you should look it up. It's called the Decode project in Barcelona. You know, some really, you know, smart young hackers were thrilled to join the civil service to do that. And yeah, I think I've answered them all. I mean, the knowledge-based economy, the, you know, picking, wheeling, all that, yes, requires new language, but especially also requires a new design to the tools. But unless we have that capacity inside the civil service, it's really, really hard. And so I really recommend you start looking at how you train, how you educate, how you hire, and the culture you have in your own public administration as part of that building up. And it's not just more, you know, bums on seats. It really is about the ambition itself of the public service, and to make sure it's not state versus business. It's always going to be a partnership, but the partnership needs to really be a mutualistic partnership, and using your concrete problems on the ground, the ones that students are facing, that old people are facing, that families are facing, that your housing structures are facing, to test whether you can form this new partnership. So purpose is at the center and not in the periphery.
Thank you very much. We wish you could join us for the light lunch we're having here in your honor.
Well,
But
hey,
another
Uber
time.
Eats.
Thank you very much,
Send it to me.
Professor.
Thank you.
And good luck.
Thank you so
شكرا
much.
للجميع. أهلا وسهلا فيكم. تفضلوا على العشاء.